7 months ago, Apple introduced the iPhone 15. They sold it as a giant leap forward as opposed to the previous model, with an all-new design, incredible new technologies, unbelievable cameras. In this video, we are going to check which of those features have ended up being useful, which have ended up being disappointing, and finally, as a conclusion, if it is worth it to buy the iPhone 15 7 months later. As always, you have an Amazon link with a discount down below in the description, just in case at the end of the video you want to buy it or take a look. That said, let's begin by talking about the first improvement, which is also one of the best improvements in my opinion. For the first time, I think in history, Apple has used a matte glass finish on the back of one of its regular phones. Until now, it was only available on the Pro model. This, of course, may seem a little irrelevant because in the end, this is a very subtle aesthetic detail, but believe me, it has a very big impact in your user experience. First, because the phone feels much more premium when you have it in your hand, and second, because thanks to this matte finish, it is almost impossible to stain the phone with dirty and oily fingerprints. For reference, in the 6 months that I've had the iPhone 15, I've never cleaned it or wiped it with any cloth, and just look at it. You could swear I just took it out of the box. I know that many of you don't really care about this because you're going to put a case on the phone, but for those of you who, like me, want to carry the phone naked, this is a great improvement as opposed to the fingerprint magnet that was the iPhone 14. That being said though, a lot of people were disappointed with this design as it was incredibly boring. Instead of the vibrant colors we got in previous years, it seemed like Apple just ran out of ink. We got barely blue, barely red, barely yellow. Back in September, people were deeming it as the worst color palette ever in iPhone history. But after 7 months, I have to say, I think Apple made the right call. The phone feels a lot more elegant, a lot more classy, and 6 months in, I'm not tired of the color, which used to be an issue with the more punchy tones on the previous models. Moving on, we of course have to talk about the internal components. As many of you know, Apple chose to include last year's A16 chip instead of the A17 Pro. Something that at first seemed like bad news because Apple was selling the A17 Pro as a new generation, unparalleled revolution in the world of mobile technology, but after some time, we've actually found out that they are not so different from each other, with just a 10% difference in speed. In my case, I have the normal iPhone 15 and the iPhone 15 Pro. I've tested both of them intensively in all kinds of tasks, and I promise you that there's hardly any difference in speed between the two. Actually, sometimes the normal 15 goes faster than the Pro. The only real downside is that if you want to play one of the new console games that are coming out for the iPhone, you are going to have to suck it up and buy the Pro model. Apple has blocked these games from working on the normal iPhone 15, not due to a lack of power as we've seen, but as a strategy to make more people spend more money on their top tier phones. Another big disappointment, as many of you know, is the USB-C port, which sure, Apple has included in both the normal version and the Pro version, but not in the same way. In the Pro models, they used the USB-C 3.0 standard, which allows you to connect it to a screen, to high-speed memories, or even in the future, transform your iPhone into a desktop computer like you can do on the iPad. But on the other hand, the iPhone 15 and 15 Plus got the USB-C 2.0 standard, which only allows you to charge the phone like you could do before and transfer photos very slowly from your phone to the computer like you could do before with Lightning. And I know a lot of you already knew, but I have to clarify because I'm sure that many seeing the marketing thought that the two models had access to all the new USB-C functionalities. But anyways, moving on, one of the least talked about points during the keynote was the battery, with barely 30 seconds of attention. But after 6 months of use, I think it's one of the main improvements on the iPhone 15. Number one, because it lasts longer than the iPhone 14, something we could already see back in September with the first comparisons. And number two, because it has much better battery health, which is one of the things that worried me the most. With the previous generation, many users reported disastrous results after several months of use, which forced them to consider changing the battery not even a year in after buying the phone. But this year, at least in my case, after 6 months, the phone still has 100% battery health with over 100 charge cycles. Another new feature on the iPhone 15 is the dynamic island, one of the most hyped up components by, well, everyone. For those of you who don't know, it is kind of a small pill that shows us different settings or data in a dynamic way depending on what we're doing. I personally had a lot of interest in this feature because I couldn't test it with the iPhone 14 Pro, but after 7 months, I really haven't taken any advantage of it. Ever. All the things that it can display are either stuff that we already had previously with the notch or things that I don't really need, especially because to access them you have to touch the top of the phone and it's quite uncomfortable. The only good thing about it is that it's considerably smaller than the notch, so we can have more screen space available, but I don't really think it's a revolution like a lot of people deemed it to be back in 2023. Where we did see a very big change is in the screen section, where Apple has included the same panel that we had on the iPhone 14 Pro. So now we can go up to 2000 nits of brightness outdoors, in addition to having a better calibrated panel and nicer colors. As always, the only detail missing is the 120Hz refresh rate, which once again, Apple decided not to include on the standard model. Truth is that when I bought it in September, I was quite angry because nowadays even an entry-level Xiaomi phone has 120Hz. But now, 7 months later, I'm actually even more angry. We're talking about a new generation phone with a top tier spec sheet and a top tier price. It is an absolute shame to see that out of all the high-end phones that have come out in the past 4 years, the normal iPhone is the only one that still doesn't have high refresh rate. I mean, at this point, it's getting kind of ridiculous. It's even rumored that the iPhone 16 won't have this feature either. Let's hope it doesn't end up being true. Oh, and by the way, also important, since we don't have 120Hz, we cannot use the always on display feature that we have on the Pro models. Apple only allows this functionality on 120Hz screens. The only thing that makes me feel better about this is that the always on display functionality is not even that useful. But anyways, finally, let's move on to the camera section, which, what a surprise, it is also kind of disappointing if we compare it to what Apple was promising in the keynote. More specifically, I'm talking about the new 48 megapixel camera that was sold as a giant leap in quality, but that practically does not change anything as opposed to the old 12 megapixel camera. What you're seeing here are photos taken with the iPhone 15 camera and the iPhone 14 camera. As you can see, they are practically the same. And they are the same because both cameras have almost identical sensors and almost identical optics. We are talking about microscopic differences in size and aperture. So even though we now have 48 megapixels, if the rest of the components remain the same or almost the same, results will also remain the same, unless we take photos with perfect lighting conditions and zoom in at 700%. The only real good thing about 48 megapixels is that they allow you to cut a portion of the sensor and take 2x photos at 12 megapixels without needing an additional 2x camera, which also of course applies to video, maintaining all resolutions and refresh rates. So you can record 4K video at 60 FPS using that cropped portion of the sensor, something quite impressive. Then of course we also have an ultra-wide camera, which unfortunately is the same one we had last year and the year before and the year before and the year before. And once again, it is a camera that I have barely used because although it is very practical and very useful in a lot of situations, it is quite inferior to the main camera, which is the one I end up using in all those situations. And well, unfortunately, the same thing can be said about the selfie camera, which has been the same since the iPhone 12, if I'm not mistaken. Although, since it's the only camera we have at the front, there is no way around it. You have to use it if you want to take a selfie. Finally, I would like to mention for all of you who have doubts that the logarithmic recording for some unknown reason is only available on the iPhone 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max. The iPhone 15 does not have access to this feature in spite of it being perfectly capable. And I say this because when it came out, many thought that it would end up trickling down to the base model with a software update. But no, more than 6 months later, it seems like Apple wants to save it for its premium Pro models. So, in conclusion, we know all the new features that Apple sold us in the keynote, we know what each one of them are and what they do, but now we also know how useful they actually are in our daily lives. The processor is practically the same as the one on the Pro phones, the USB-C port doesn't add any functionality as opposed to Lightning, and the cameras are, except for the new 2x mode, identical to those on the iPhone 14. The only real useful advantages are the matte glass, the increased brightness on the screen, and in a very microscopical and practically irrelevant way, the dynamic island. I honestly believe that if you have an iPhone 14 or 13, you should never consider updating to the 15 because there's not that many differences to justify the price. But for those of you who have an iPhone 12 or older, I do think it could be a good upgrade. As I said at the beginning of the video, you have a discount link for Amazon down below in the description in case you want to buy it. And now that the video is about to end, I recommend you go take a look.